Hello everyone. It is 10 o'clock and we are ready to begin to get started with session 5A of the Canadian Society for Renaissance Studies panel entitled Political Imaginations in Tudor-Stuart Drama. I'm Erin Kelly. I'm at University of Victoria, which means that I am currently coming to you all from the unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, which is the Wasanich, Esquimalt, and Songhees people. And I am very, very humbled to work on this land and to be a settler on this land, and hope that we bring to all the work that we do together some thinking about how we can move forward in ways that work towards truth and reconciliation. And so I think that it's good to get started, and I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. Dr. Erin Ellerbeck paper today is titled Thomas Randolph, Ben Jonson, and the Art of Adoption. Erin is an assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Victoria, which means that I'm actually really fortunate to have her as my colleague at University of Victoria. And I'm overjoyed to say that her first monograph will be published by University of Toronto Press in January 2022. Erin, I'm really looking forward to this paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, other Erin, and I say other Erin with affection, and she calls me the same. So Thomas Randolph, Ben Jonson, and the Art of Adoption. In a gratulatory to Master Ben Jonson for his adopting him to be his son, a poem from around 1630, Thomas Randolph thanks the famous poet and playwright for assuming the role of his literary father. Randolph had apparently been selected by Jonson as one of the sons making up the tribe of Ben, the group of writers who considered themselves akin to Jonson in ability and style. The adoption, according to Randolph, established him as the beneficiary of Jonson's poetic legacy. And I'll show you the poem now. I was not born to Helicon, nor dare presume to think myself a muse's heir. I have no title to Parnassus Hill, nor any acre of it by the will of a dead ancestor. Nor could I be aught but a tenant unto poetry. But thy adoption quits me of all fear, and makes me challenge a child's portion there. I am akin to heroes, being thine, and part of my alliance is divine. Orpheus, Musaeus, Homer too, besides thy brothers by the Roman mother side, as Ovid, Virgil, and the Latin lyre, that is so like thee, Horace. The whole choir of poets are, by thy adoption, all my uncles. Thou hast given me power to call Phoebus himself my grandsire. By this grant, each sister of the nine is made my aunt. The practice of adoption affords Randolph, and by extension, Jonson, a model for conceptualizing poetic influence. Jonson's creation of a literary family and his role as a progenitor of poets ensures that he will have literary successors whose talents are imagined to be derived from those of the great writers of the past as well as his own. Randolph had no previous claim to Mounts Helicon or Parnassus, classical sites of poetic inspiration. However, through his newly established relation to Jonson, whom he believes belongs legitimately to the family of authors that includes Horace, Homer, and Virgil, he becomes part of a literary genealogy that includes even the gods of antiquity. The adoption grants Randolph an imaginative network of relatives upon whose authority his own poetry can stand. With the newfound power to call Phoebus his grandfather and the Muses his aunts, he can reshape his artistic identity. In accounting for the transmission of artistic inspiration and aptitude, Randolph also elucidates a facet of adoption that was esteemed by classical authors in particular. Adoptive families are composed deliberately and therefore rely on choice rather than biology. As Randolph proclaims later in the poem, he is the son of Jonson's adoption, not his lust. Randolph's adoption is literary in two senses. He is both an author who will now write in the style of Jonson and someone who has been written into Jonson's family line. The prevalence of adopted characters in early modern drama perhaps owes something to the literary and theatrical qualities of the practice itself. The fact that children can be chosen rather than born into a family underscores adoption's close association with fiction and drama. Adoptees and their families act out relations that are presumed to be innate. That is, like players on the stage, they perform the roles of parents, children, and siblings when those roles are not dictated by biology. Adoption's theatrical nature meant that it was frequently viewed as a form of familial relation that could not produce the equivalent of biological offspring. William Clerk, for instance, maintained in the Trial of Bastardy from 1594 that adopted children could not be considered legitimate because they were artificial. Adoptees are, quote, a bare imitation of nature, Clerk stated, and there is no place for them in England. On the early modern stage, however, adoption's imitative nature, like the theater itself, presents the opportunity to envision the formation and transformation of identity. As Barbara Diefendorf observes with a nod to Stephen Greenblatt, the family is of profound importance as an element in and context for Renaissance self-fashioning. The adoptive family allows for an even greater negotiation of familial identity that accounts for tensions between a character's individuality and their ties to a birth family, and also their merging with an adoptive family. The theatrical adoptee poses a challenge to the seemingly fixed nature of lineage-based identity. The suppleness of adoptive familial bonds is then a reminder of the transformative nature of theater itself. The regular appearance of adopted characters on stage reflects the omnipresence of adoption-like practices in England, early modern England. Although there was no legal mechanism for adoption, a culture of adoption outside the law was cultivated, and non-biological pseudo-familial attachments were forged continuously. Several institutions were related to adoption and involved the exchange of children between households. The most obvious case is the tradition of service, or fostering out, in which a child was sent into another household in a position of service or as an apprentice. Children were often put into the service in the households of their relations, but they could also be placed with unrelated families of comparable or higher social status. Servant children became part of their receptive families, however temporarily, and moralists argued that they should be treated as such. Wardship was another well-established tradition, and its royal abuse was a concern for the nobility. The underage sons and daughters of deceased noblemen in some cases became wards of the reigning monarch, who could then control their finances and arrange their marriages. As Joel Hirstfield remarks, there can have been few noble or gentle families whose genealogy does not bear the inescapable marks of one or more feudal wardships. Wet nursing likewise removed children from the family home, although for a considerably shorter period of time. Despite warnings from doctors who opposed the practice on the grounds of babies' health, and despite the opposition of the church, wealthy women sent children to the homes of hired nurses for 12 to 18 months in order to relieve themselves of the burden of breastfeeding. It was feared that wet nurses could pass on their own characteristics through their milk to suckling children. As Valerie Fields observes, any discussion of infant and childcare in the period must include the important role of surrogate mothers, which were played by wet nurses during the impressionable years of early infancy. In early modern England, then, family life was in many ways characterized by adoption, but the concept of adoption was understood according to prevalent political and theological metaphors. Facing a succession crisis in which she was expected to produce a biological heir, Queen Elizabeth styled herself as an adoptive mother. During her first parliament in 1559, the Speaker of the House of Commons urged the Queen, quote, by marriage to bring forth children, heirs both of their mother's virtue and empire, end quote. In response, Elizabeth envisioned herself as the parent of her people. She replied that she was content for the time being to be a, quote, good mother of my country, end quote. In 1563, she assured her subjects that, though after my death you may have many stepdames, yet shall you never have any more mother than I mean to be unto you all. Although Elizabeth was not the first female monarch to suggest that she was an adoptive mother to her kingdom, she used the metaphor to deflect attention from her lack of biological children. Elizabeth's metaphors of adoption complemented and perhaps derived from the Christian tradition. The term adoption is used in the Bible to refer to spiritual adoption or the taking in of believers by God. In the book of Romans, the eternal adoptive relationship between God and humankind is emphasized. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but ye have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. The spirit of adoption establishes a filial relationship to God. Such a bond replicates the paternal filial bond between God and Jesus Christ. Spiritual adoption notionally diminishes the mortal emphasis on earthly blood relations. That early modern writers likewise described relations to God in adoptive terms suggests the widespread understanding of Christian faith as a process of adoption. Pamphlets such as Thomas Granger's A Looking Glass for Christians, with the lengthy subtitle, or The Comfortable Doctrine of Adoption, wherein every true believer may behold his blessed estate in the kingdom of grace, from 1620, suggests that authentic familial connections can be formed by adoption. Granger states that God gives his followers the spirit of sons by whom we call him Father, even as natural sons do their parents. Echoing the book of Galatians, Granger describes spiritual adoption as freedom from slavery. Once adopted, quote, the servant or bondman liveth no longer to his former masters, but to his adopter, not in servitude, but in freedom, not in slavish, but in son-like fear, end quote. In his estimation, the Christian adoptive bond occasions genuine familial feeling. The adoptee escapes bondage and is instead subject to the bonds of familial affection. On the early modern stage, genre often dictated the depiction of adoptive practices and shaped their outcomes. Shakespeare's romances contain perhaps the richest and most recognizable collection of adopted characters. The romantic generic conventions of families who are divided and then often miraculously reunited presents opportunities for children to be incorporated into adoptive families temporarily. The Winter's Tale, Pericles, Cymbeline, and The Tempest all include characters who establish ties to non-biological family members with varying degrees of success. In all cases, save Marina's and Pericles, the new familial arrangements of adoptive children are seemingly permanent. Their non-biological families are adoptive families rather than temporary foster families. The lexicographer Randall Cotgrave defined adoption in a dictionary of the French and English tongues from 1611 as the conferring on frem children all advantages belonging to natural ones. He later explains that a frem is a person who is neither a dweller with nor kin unto us, and it's listed under the description for stranger. Cotgrave's definition provides a starting point for the identification as adoptees of characters who are afforded the advantages and sometimes the disadvantages of biological children, but who are not biologically related to those whom they consider their family members. Such advantages and disadvantages are various, ranging from the emotional to the financial. In some cases, adoptive parents and children on the early modern stage know that they are in adoptive relationships, while in other cases, some parties are unaware of the missing biological connection. Cotgrave's definition suggests also that adoption is a practice in competition with nature itself. Although adopted children are not natural, they are made to seem so. Comedies and tragicomedies displayed varied models for adoption and for the family as the product of human agency. In these plays, heirship and financial considerations often determine how adoptive families are formed. In A King and No King by Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, a childless monarch secretly adopts a boy, Arbaces, as his heir. Arbaces' claim to the throne is later jeopardized when his adoptive origins are revealed. Adoption as a strategy for inheritance is used to comical effect in Ben Jonson's Volpone, which involves a competition between fortune-hunting would-be adoptees. Some early modern comedies feature impoverished mothers who deliberately place their infant children with wealthy families for a better chance at social and material success. Such cases may not appear to be straightforward instances of adoption, because the adoptive parents do not necessarily know that they are raising someone else's offspring, but the children may nonetheless form strong attachments to their adoptive families. When they learn about their birth identities, skipped a line. In John Lilly's Mother Bombi, children have been inserted surreptitiously into affluent households. And Erin, talking about silly plays, I'm all for reviving Mother Bombi, which is about as goofy as it gets. When the children learn about their birth identities, they are horrified by the idea of reverting to their biological roots. Aesius proclaims that he will not swap his father for all of this, while Selina asks, "Do you think I'll be cousined of my father?" Concern about loss of economic status is implicit in their protests. The wealthy children do not want to become impoverished. Thomas Middleton's "No wit, no help like a woman's" portrays an affluent child who is exchanged for a poor one by a cunning wet nurse. Economic considerations also govern Jonson's The New Inn, in which the host's adopted son, Frank, is in fact a girl in disguise. Frank's mother places the child in the host's home because she cannot provide care. In a final twist, it is revealed that the host is actually Frank's biological father and was therefore never an adoptive parent at all. Lest it seem that adoption occurs only for economic reasons or to permit the comical confusion of identities, I note that some characters seek urgently to take in children and to raise them as their own. In Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, Oberon and Titania compete for custody of the Indian boy. In All's Well That Ends Well, the Countess asks Helena to be both her daughter-in-law and her adoptive daughter. Such characters form public and affectionate bonds with the children whom they wish to adopt. The degree to which emotional ties were established among family members in the early modern period is a topic of long-standing critical debate. Following Philip Aries, who argued in Centuries of Childhood, A Social History of Family Life in 1962, that high rates of infant and child mortality encouraged parents to become emotionally unattached to their offspring, Lawrence Stone suggested in The Family, Sex, and Marriage in England from 1977 that the frequent death of children made it folly to invest too much emotional capital in such ephemeral beings. Revisionist historians such as Alan McFarlane, Linda Pollock, Ralph Hallbrook, and Stephen Osmond have since argued against Aries and Stone's assertions, emphasizing familial closeness rather than distance through the use of archival evidence such as letters and family papers. Adoption presents a unique case for examining familial affect, because adoptive familial bonds are not innate, but are instead typically established deliberately. The practice demonstrates that familial bonds might be based solely on affection rather than on consanguinity. As John Meredith makes clear in his Book of Notes and Commonplaces from 1582, the adoptive bond is primarily emotional. Quote, "Men do call children adopted, those which be not natural children to them, which do choose and accept them for their children. But they are it only by the love and favor of him which taketh them for his children, and give them such right as he might give to his natural children." End quote. Love and favor are substituted for blood. Dramatic examples of adoption afford the opportunity to examine to what degree ties of affection are imagined as being forged between an adopter and an adoptee. Tragedies often foreground the ostensible weakness of adoptive ties and show that the desire to adopt is misguided. In Othello, Brabantio declares that he would rather adopt a child than get it. He seeks to eliminate the uncertainty he perceives in his natural progeny, namely Desdemona, of whose behavior he does not approve, and to acquire confidence in a family that could be said to be premeditated. Although Brabantio's preference for adoption has classical antecedents and is, in a sense, a venerable position, his desire to disown his innocent daughter is destructive. Whereas in comedies, identities that have been obscured by adoption can still be clarified, in tragedies, adoption can utterly dissolve identity. Middleton's Women Beware Women, for example, stages the result of the disorder and confusion of identity that a perceived adoption can cause. In that play, Isabella's belief that she is adopted and her subsequent alteration of her identity lead her to engage in an incestuous relationship. Generic conventions tend to cause adoption to be portrayed as a practice full of possibility or one that can intensify despair. Adoptive ties are managed and sustained. They are the product of human intervention rather than the result of biology. As several of my examples have shown, adoption and imaginative creation are intimately linked. Randolph's adoption by Jonson demonstrates the human resolve to shape environments, to build the world as we see fit. His insistence that the whole choir of poets are by Jonson's adoption all his uncles situates art alongside adoption. Like art, adoption alters that which exists in nature. Adoptive and adopted characters hold the capacity, like the poet or the dramatist, for invention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was absolutely fascinating, and I can't wait to have questions about that.